Good morning, all. It's absolutely a pleasure for really having you with us today for the India Dialog conversation. As you know, this is the third in the series, and we have a very special guest today. We have Hisham Mundol, who has joined us from Delhi. In fact, Richard and I are today sitting on the campus and enjoying the beautiful weather in the background. But Hisham, I'm sure you are going to be talking about climate and issues pertaining to climate, and you're possibly sitting in one of the most polluted cities of the world. So not to trying to push you into the corner, but that's an important issue that we have to grapple with as we move along. And of course, I'm joined by Richard, who's the director for the US-ATMC at Stanford. And we do this program every month, as you know, and we are really looking at creating it as a series. And this culminates with the India Dialog Summit on February 29 and March 1 of 2024. But just a quick introduction to Hisham. Hisham is somebody who's been in the development sector for many, many years. His present role, he is the chief advisor for the Environmental Defense Fund, which is one of the most or the foremost environmental issue-based enterprise agency or not-for-profit enterprise. But before that, he's actually worked with CIF. That is the Children Investment Fund Foundation, and he has done an amazing level of work with them on issues pertaining to health, education, nutrition, livelihoods, etc. But before that, in fact, he has been instrumental in running the AIDS Control Organization or the National AIDS Control Organization within India. So he's somebody who's actually worked on the ground, understands the issues and the challenges that the country faces, and he's actually been instrumental in bringing about a lot of change within the country as well. He was also part of Wikipedia. That's the interesting part of it. So he's been somebody who's worked on media, etc. So he understands how to bring change through conversations and such things. Worked with people like Unilever, Worldtel, Accenture, Infosys. So he's actually been part of the whole movement in terms of understanding from various perspectives, from the government, from the not-for-profit setup, or even the enterprise setup. So this is where Hisham is. So Hisham, thanks a lot for joining us today. It's absolutely a pleasure to have you with us. And I think without further ado, I'll just hand over the floor to you for your initial remarks, and then we'll move in for Q&A with Richard and I. Hisham, over to you.
Amit, thanks, Richard, and thank you to everyone who's joined in. I'm increasingly convinced that the most valuable thing on the planet is time, and so thank you for the time and the invite. Thank you also to Stanford for this wonderful backdrop. I don't think I've had a better backdrop in a presentation before. What I wanted to talk about today was, and the title is what EDF sees as the vision for India, and it's an Indian pathway to shared sustainable prosperity. I'll come to that in a moment, but the way the government of India has increasingly started characterizing it is India has the opportunity to become the first major economy to industrialize without carbonizing. Just reflect on that for a moment in terms of the size of India and the fact that it almost is within grasp that we could have that first economy that decouples growth from emissions. We come back to shared sustainable prosperity, and I want to pause on each of those words. Prosperity for a relatively poor and income unequal country like India, because India's aspirations are and should be much more than poverty alleviation. The shared part of it, because the basics of life like air quality and the standard of life like air temperature or air conditioning should be accessible to all, urban, rural, rich, poor, any which way you want to cut the demographic. And the sustainable part, and I say this as part of an environmental organization, it is simply not enough for something to be environmentally sustainable. It needs to be economically viable or it won't happen. And the Indian pathway, because quite frankly, there are other pathways that are out there. The American and European and Chinese pathways are the high emissions growth, high emissions driven growth that have quite frankly landed us in the problem that the world is right now in. So that's what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about 4 themes which I think give credence and credibility to the fact that this pathway might be real. The first is how India is looking at innovation, and the way the country is looking at it is how do you drive mass market green innovation as opposed to high-end niche innovation. The second is how do you have an innovate in India approach to be able to deliver the cost engineering and the scale requirements that an India needs. The third is, are there leapfrog technology opportunities for us to drive growth without emissions? And the last piece I want to be talking about is, everyone talks about the green premium. I think there is a green bonus that Indian industry is beginning to realize the opportunity on. So these are the 4 things that I wanted to talk about. But maybe just step back and let's look at the broader context to begin with. India is approaching the climate crisis with a different angle from the West. India understands the implications of climate change, and yet India's primary imperative is development. How do you balance the two? And India, the ambition of industrializing without carbonizing is possibly the way that could show the path forward, not just for India, but for many other developing countries, and honestly serves as a mirror for the more industrialized, richer world. Theme number 1 was mass market solutions. And I want to start with the automotive sector. For the longest time, electric vehicles were either clunky or terribly, niche. American and European automakers really started picking things up when Tesla came along, and suddenly you had larger, more powerful, higher-end electric vehicles. India, on the other hand, is picking up the lead in segments that could be far more useful to global mobility, and that is of the affordable city car, of scooters, of electric 3-wheelers for passengers and last-mile freight. Companies such as Tata are growing from the middle rather than the top, and the largest selling electric vehicle in India is, for example, at the $15,000 price point. Contrast this with Tesla coming in at, $50,000 plus. As a result of which, last year, 1 million electric vehicles were sold in India alone. Very, very few of them are at the high end. The majority of them are at the mass market end. And there is a lesson there, which is that if you want to drive climate action, you have to think about solutions that scale and commercial propositions that can profitably deliver on that scale. The second theme is energy. And there are 2 aspects to energy. One is on the production side. How do you generate the energy? India, as many of you are likely to know, is not blessed with fossil fuel resources to the levels that are needed. India set a target of having all of its 50% of its energy is renewable by 2030. By 2030, that 50% translates into 500 gigawatts of energy. India is already at 120 gigawatts. That's real progress. There are still issues. There's still the need for additional momentum. There's a number of issues that still need to be fixed with energy. However, in addition to the production side, making the consumption of energy more efficient is an even more exciting part of the Indian journey. Let me give you an illustration with ceiling fans. Many parts of India are hot and humid. Many in India can't afford air conditioners. Through made in India or made for India innovations, entrepreneurs in India have taken the same basic design of a ceiling fan, which hasn't changed for decades, and reduced energy use by 2/3 with just a marginal increase in pricing. And that is now $1.5 billion industry. That's the kind of potential that is available when you look at made in India innovations. I'm going to move out of climate for a moment, but when India launched a mission to Mars, the price tag for that was depending on which report you read, $75 to $85 million. When NASA launched a mission to Mars, depending on which report you read, it's $2 billion or $3 billion. That's the kind of order of magnitude difference that's possible when you look at innovations designed in India for India. So that's the made for India innovation side. The third theme is around leapfrog technologies. I'm convinced that India is going to be both the source of climate innovation for the world as well as a market for clean solutions, often by leapfrogging centralized fossil power. India has done these leapfrogs before and at massive scale. For example, the hundreds of millions who moved directly to mobile phones while avoiding heavy investments in telecoms landlines or mobile banking and jumping right over brick and mortar bank branches. It's stunning to see how many have experienced banking for the very first time on a mobile device, never seen the door of a bank branch. These are the kind of leapfrog technologies that consistently India has delivered on, and it's now beginning to show its signs in climate change. The illustration here is the humble light bulb. Since Edison invented it a couple of hundred years ago, I'm guessing now, not much changed. And then suddenly LED bulbs came along. These used less energy and lasted significantly longer. When their prices began to reduce, India did a few smart things. It aggregated demand, it directed public procurement, it's incentivized manufacturing, and there was aggressive promotion of bulbs. That is now a $4 billion industry in India alone every year. And many households have transitioned from no bulbs directly to energy efficient LED bulbs. The last theme I want to talk about is business. And Anand Mahindra, the head of the Mahindra Group, characterizes it most eloquently when he says, climate change is both the crisis of the century as well as the business opportunity of the century. Let me illustrate. In many areas, there is a green premium that sustainable businesses have to overcome. That overcoming will happen through technology and R&D improvements to reduce costs, and as well as through economies of scale as things increase. The green premium is real, and depending on the sector, it's more difficult or less difficult to overcome. However, what I wanted to talk about is the green bonus that Indian industry is beginning to realize through sustainable operations. And I want to illustrate it with one of the less green sectors that are out there, the cement sector, not traditionally regarded as the poster boy for climate change. It's an odd term, but India's cement sector is regarded as the greenest on the planet. And the reason for that is that 85% of the raw material that goes into cement production in India is fly ash. Fly ash is waste product from thermal power plants. And then so there is a circular economy aspect to it. About 60% of India's cement is produced using renewable energy. And the overall manufacturing process is a quarter more energy efficient than most other cement sectors in the world. Now, this didn't happen because of government policy or diktat. This happened because one company started innovating, on sources of raw materials, and other companies realized that this one company was having better margins than them, and they followed suit. This idea of a race to the top, this idea of inspiring or perspiring competitors through lighthouse companies is central to how we will advance the green business agenda in India. So in summary, India is showing a new model for development in the world. It's almost akin to once upon a time when you had, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, and then India came along and was one of the architects of the non-aligned movement. There is a different pathway that's possible. I believe that India could become a lot more influential on the planet on aspects like recycling, on bringing down the price of green hydrogen, on the use of data technology. And we will increasingly see these innovations being spurred in India. I want to pause on the question of hydrogen because there is a storyline within that. The current cost of green hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced from renewable sources, is about $4 a kilo. For it to be commercially viable, it needs to go down to $1 a kilo. Under the recent IRA bill, which is a great bill in many aspects in the US, there is a $3 a kilo consumption subsidy, not a production subsidy. So there's no incentive to reduce costs. India, on the other hand, looks at this and realizes it doesn't have the fiscal space to provide a $3 a kilo consumption subsidy. And so what is quite likely to happen in India is there is going to be far greater motivation and incentive to bring down the costs of green hydrogen, where quite frankly, that doesn't exist in the US because it's being bankrolled by a really large government program. That's one aspect of it. The last aspect I just wanted to leave you all with before we get into a conversation is the question of climate justice. Climate change is not caused only by what we do today and what we do tomorrow, but what we have done historically since the start of the industrial age. That is the sum total of all of the stuff that we've emitted out there, and that's what's causing, warming. It's what's causing the weather shifts, etc. India has been a marginal contributor to the historical emissions, and India's per capita emissions are 1/10 of the US and roughly a quarter of China or Europe. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring the question of climate finance into the table because this green transition for India is going to be expensive, as it is going to be expensive for many other industrial economies. There is a almost moral imperative for the more industrialized countries, which have achieved their levels of affluence through a very high fossil fuel driven growth model, to start putting money on the table for this transition. Now, if you read the price tags, they are several $1 trillion. The political economy doesn't exist for that kind of financial flow from richer countries to poorer countries. But what the world can do is look at the example of what happened when COVID struck, and the vaccine, with some hiccups, did eventually move to all parts of the world. We need the equivalent of a COVID vaccine global rollout for new climate technology. We need the equivalent of a Marshall Plan on financing for the rest of the world, because one thing's for sure, climate change doesn't know boundaries. And we're all in this one together. I hope that I've given you some sense of what's working and what's positive about India. I didn't intend to suggest that everything is perfect. There are still a number of areas where India can and should be doing better. But yeah, those were my opening remarks.
Great, Hisham. This is fascinating in terms of what is happening. I'm sure Richard also has a lot of questions, but if you allow, I'll possibly go with the first one. So you make a very important point that India's aspirations have to be beyond poverty alleviation. It has to focus on, say, quality of life. How do you think we can actually move into that direction, one? And the subsidiary question onto that is that you say is like ACs can actually be one other reflection of quality of life. But there is a recent report which has possibly emerged. If 1 billion people in India end up having ACs, it will scorch the earth, or it will scorch the climate out there. The surface temperatures will rise. So where is the solution somewhere? Because I do fundamentally agree that everybody has a right to have a comfortable quality of life. So you cannot make people suffer. And we're already seeing that the surface temperatures in India have possibly risen by about 5 degrees centigrade in the last 20 odd years. So there is a significant change that is happening. Over to you, Hisham.
Sure. So let me take the second one first. If there are 1 billion air conditioners in India, forget the earth, it will scorch India, and that is a problem. The kinds of things which I imagine could happen is, there are two options. One is we, somehow persuade the population that you don't need air conditioning. That isn't going to happen. It's more comfortable when you're at a more, reasonable temperature. What you will find is stuff like the ceiling fans example that I gave, where you have some product available at different price points. If you look at it as the consumer segment, what you will find is innovations in air conditioning technology that make fundamental air conditioning more energy efficient. On the energy efficiency point, it often strikes me as odd where when you talk to an Indian corporate, the amount of time and effort that they spend on driving efficiencies in their manufacturing process is something that I don't regularly hear of in other parts of the world. How to extract the most amount of commercial output per joule of energy is something that really is being pushed hard. And the third aspect of it is, for a moment, ignore the air conditioning part. If you fix the back end of the energy supply, if we are able to get to 50% renewables, a 500 gigawatt thing, then we won't be scorching much. So that's that would be the way I would imagine it. So low-end scaled innovation, technology innovation for air conditioners. I would imagine on something like air conditioners, the way we have on what we have right now on cars. Every few years, the government updates the minimum emission norms for a car, and we go through the usual cycle where the automotive industry says, the world is going to end and we will all shut down, but they figure out a way of delivering on the new emission standards. What you have for a lot of the other products like air conditioners is a rating system, but not a compliance-based rating system. So consumers have that choice. What you're likely to see happen over the next few years is you will have, similar to automotive minimum standards, you will have minimum standards for other product categories, whichever consume large amounts of energy, and then consumers can further make a choice. On the aspirations point, I actually don't think we have a choice on that matter. People want a better quality of life. People are hungry for a better quality of life at every level of income. What is critical to be done is for us to provide kind of steps and a ladder for them to move up in it. So let me give you an example on agriculture. We could go to farmers in Punjab, and there is every year during the season, there is a lot of crop stubble burning that happens. And we go to them and we tell them, hey, because of what you're doing right now, there are people in Delhi that are coughing. So can you please stop what you're doing? Their priorities are to feed their family first. They're going to worry about their family, rightly so, and worry about what might be happening in Delhi tomorrow if after they finish feeding their family. If we can give them solutions which start with increasing incomes and improving quality of life and happen to have a climate benefit, that is far more likely to have traction and broader buy-in than otherwise. So I think a lot of it is about how well we articulate the narrative and how disciplined we are in terms of the kind of things that we choose to do. If it's not economically viable, it doesn't make a difference how environmentally responsible it is. It isn't going to happen in any case. So we need to find ways of working the economics. And it's almost like incumbent on the climate community, if we don't have an economically viable solution, to go back to the drawing board and find something that has economic viability, and then come back to policymakers or anyone else out there.
That's fascinating, Hisham. So going back to the stubble burning issue that you're talking from Punjab, Haryana, or that belt, what is it that we can specifically do? Because somehow there are research reports again which say that possibly 83% of pollution happens because of stubble burning in Delhi. And there is a need to really manage that crisis as well, because the kind of health impact those set of things have is tremendous, because it increases the health costs for the country. It has a huge detrimental effect on quality of life of people. So how do we set it right? Like, because if you just look at the AQIs in most of the North Indian cities, we are anywhere between, say, 300 to 500, and in comparison to where we are sitting right now, in Palo Alto, it is close to about 30, 40, maximum 50. How do we really resolve for this? Because we cannot wait for the next 10 years or the next 20 years, because the urgency of the situation is very, very high.
Oh, sure. So let's take the example of Delhi as a city, and Delhi has a bad air quality problem for sure. But the majority of it is not caused by crop stubble burning. There is a component of it, but there's, almost equal contributions from transport, from construction, from, dust in the air, from industries. There is a need for many other action points that are out there in Delhi. I make this point because sometimes it's easy to vilify one particular source, and then what you end up doing is not addressing, the 60-70% other contributors. Delhi doesn't have an air quality problem only when there is crop stubble burning. It has an issue across the board. Many other cities similarly have it without, proximate large agricultural field. On crop stubble burning, there's like 2 or 3 dimensions to it. One is that if you look at Indian agriculture, the majority of it is really small landholder farms, so very, very small plots of land. And you have the added complexity of, you have landlord farmers and tenant farmers. Tenant farmers are the ones who actually plot the land. Tenant farmers tend to be relatively poorer than the landlords, and have very little access to capital. There are solutions around crop stubble burning that are there. There is machinery that can, make economic use of it, but they cost money. That kind of capital is not available to the average farmer. And so is there ways that you can, figure out financing options, renting models, etc., where farmers can be able to access it? Just on this, I want to move to something outside of crop stubble burning, but in the broader agriculture space, livestock. Methane emissions are one of the they contribute more to global warming than carbon, because methane absorbs heat much more. Globally, a lot of methane emissions comes from oil and gas. In India, a lot of it comes from the livestock sector. Now, there's livestock farmers are, the starting point is relatively high levels of poverty, very low levels of capital. And so we need to find ways of working with them on this. The way that we would look at something like this is to say, how do we start with increasing incomes and yields? So are there interventions that are possible using improved animal health and animal feeding techniques that increase milk production? That doesn't reduce methane emissions, but what it does is, per liter of milk, you're now emitting less methane than you used to. The second is, can you drive economic value from manure? Can you use manure at a much more industrial scale to create biogas, which then is, savings to farmers in terms of how they're otherwise, using fuel or buying fuel for cooking. And even if it's firewood, there is still a time or a cost attached to getting that fuel food, that improvements in health, etc. So those are the kinds of approaches that you would take. What they do is, per liter of milk, you're suddenly emitting less in methane, but you're also increasing farmer incomes, you're improving quality of life. Those are the kinds of solutions. It's a farmer-first approach that needs to happen to address climate change, not a climate-centric approach to climate-smart ag.
Very fascinating. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Hisham, thank you for a really thought-provoking presentation. There's so much I want to ask about, but let me start with this pronoun we. We have to do this. We have to be thinking farmer first, and so on and so forth. And I think that one of your points that I agree with completely is that if you're talking to people, the first order of business for them is going to be how to have a better life, how to have an improved quality of life. What do you think are some ways in which the large population of India, including rural as well as urban people who don't have great jobs already, how can we increase their awareness of the contributions that they individually need to make in order to have a development that does not carbonize?
Sure. I want to take you to Indore. Indore is a 3 million population city in the center of India in Madhya Pradesh state. And the Indian government has rankings on the Clean India mission, which was an urban sanitation effort. For 6 years in a row, maybe more, Indore has been winning the cleanest city of the country award. And I remember when I first went there, to be honest, I went a little skeptical about these rankings and how they actually get figured. But you land in Indore and you immediately notice that there is something very, very different about the level of sanitation in the city. Indore also happens to have Asia's largest bio-CNG plant. Most of the urban organic waste that is generated goes into this plant, and it produces bio-CNG, which fuels 400 city municipal buses, and it is sold to the municipal buses at a few rupees cheaper than what is the prevailing price of diesel in the city. It's a great story, but it only works if you have primary segregation of waste at source. At a household to household level, you need to segregate the waste. There are technologies and solutions where if you don't segregate the waste, you can still find a way of doing it, but it just messes up with the economics of it. Yeah. How did Indore manage, a citizen level primary segregation of waste? They took all the regular things in the toolkit, and for 3 or 4 years, they talked to citizenry about why sanitation was important, what was the individual benefits to them, what they could do about it. There was enforcement by, I was sitting in my hotel room and I was having a cup of tea in the morning, and I observed segregated dustbins, and the person comes out, and this isn't an inspection, there wasn't a big fancy visit, but I saw the person look through the garbage before he puts it into the truck. There are fines, for example, in terms of there is some amount of stick that is needed. But there's also, and they had ambassadors, they had government officials talking about it. You took that as the primary common objective of citizens. And now the fact that that Indore is the cleanest city in the country is a matter of pride with the population. And it is possible now. To be fair, these examples are few and far between, but mine is a half-class kind of approach. Let's figure out what are the things that Indore did right. And it wasn't just setting up the plant. Anybody can set up a plant. It's getting citizenry involved, and that's possible. That's possible in this kind of space. Another example I'd give is one of our biggest food delivery companies is called Zomato. And very recently, they, when you order food that comes in, it comes with a whole bunch of plastic and all sorts of paraphernalia. They came up with a plastic neutral commitment. I can't imagine that they came up with that commitment without listening to consumers, and consumers must have been balking at the sheer level of plastic volume that was coming into their households for something that was convenient. So it's when citizens feel ownership and start beginning to feel pride that change happens. I think another aspect of it is when the Clean India mission initially started a few years ago, one of the drivers to it was somebody had started working out what was the per capita savings in preventable health costs directly attributable to poor sanitation. That number stuck in policymakers' mind. And they realized that this was an important, substantive thing at a global, at a national level. If you think about fertilizer usage, we need to figure out how, at a farmer level, optimizing fertilizer usage for a particular crop, for a particular agroecological zone. How does that save you money? How much money does it save you while keeping your yields constant at that level? And at a national government level, to say we spend $25 billion a year on agricultural subsidies. How much can we save while securing yields and improving incomes? So it's a broader package rather than just an individual aspect of it.
Hisham, thank you very much. Those are great examples, really inspiring examples. I do have one more question about this, because you're showing the role of the general people's attitudes and also the government's attitudes, and how the private sector has to be responsive to that. But certainly implementing new technologies costs money. And one of the challenges that you have with economic development is increase on a massive scale for energy needs. And, you have to develop these large, mass production manufacturing companies. And right now, it's hard to see the technologies that would allow for that kind of increase in energy use without significant increase in greenhouse gas emission and so forth. So this involves the establishment of an industrial base as well. And one of the problems is that even if you tell them that over a 5-year period they can earn more money, but have a better profit if they go to a greener solution, the capital investment has to happen this month. And that's something that a lot of existing companies become unwilling to do. Do you see ways for the development of industry to really, this is something we haven't seen in the world before. And how can this happen?
Sure, that's a really good point. I want to answer it in kind of two ways. One way is there's a leading steel major that has interests in several countries. They're expanding steel production. They're expanding it in Europe, and they're expanding it in India. In Europe, they're expanding it as green steel. A lot of their expansion in India is traditional blast furnaces packaged as the greener steel of some kind or the other. Now, they're not doing it, I don't believe they're doing it because they hate India or they hate India's environment. They're doing it because there's less regulatory oversight, there's less investor pressure, there's less consumer demand, and quite frankly, there's less government subsidies as well. It is essential for the investors in this company to start realizing that when you invest in a 50, 60-year asset like a traditional blast furnace, you have to think about what's going to happen for 50, 60 years. In 10 years' time, they're not going to be able to sell a gram of steel outside into Europe. Quite likely in 20 years' time, they're not going to be able to sell a gram of steel within India. And so pricing climate risk amongst investors is one aspect that does need to be looked at. The second aspect is around net zero commitments. There are two ways that you can make net zero commitments. One is you can just make the commitment and do a lot of communications and marketing noise around it and then get investors off your back for a few years because you're making a commitment for 2030, 2040, 2050 or whatever. Or the second is to make an authentic commitment, make it, be ambitious about it and be concerted about how you then organize the rest of your enterprise. How do you start evaluating capital decisions? How do you evaluate businesses and how which businesses do you focus on as an industry? So that's kind of more in the nuts and bolts thing. But coming back to the other aspect of it, I think what you've touched on is one of the bigger gaps in India is fundamentally we don't spend enough on R&D as a nation as we should. We spend about 0.6% of GDP on R&D compared to 1.5 or so. So 1/3 of what more industrialized countries do. Within that, 70% of R&D spends in industrialized countries come from the corporate world. In India, it's only 40%. So we're not spending enough on R&D, and corporate India isn't spending enough. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that the demand and supply for innovation in India aren't talking to each other as effectively as you like. So you've got Indian corporates going and asking for a number of things, and Indian academia and research houses going and looking at something else or delivering something else. When you go to the typical climate tech meetings that run, you will have really earnest, incredibly talented startups and very committed angel investors who come in. And oftentimes the startups leave disillusioned saying that there's no real money, and the investors leave saying, these are, fancy ideas but have no relevance in the real world. And so there is a need for us to bring the demand and supply of innovation to start talking to each other, especially for climate change. It will require closer partnerships between Indian corporates and Indian academia and international academia and research shops. It will require Indian industries to start thinking about their R&D spend as not only directed at how do I do cost reduction, but how do I actually invent the technology of the future. I gave the example of the cement sector, and sure, there's a lot that they've done right. But even with everything that they've done right, if we are to double the buildings that India is going to be, that India currently has, which is what it looks like over the next 10 years, just greener cement isn't going to be enough. You're going to need fundamentally different construction material. Now, is the cement sector going to innovate and deliver that, or are you going to wait for the Elon Musk equivalent to come in and disrupt your industry? And that, and it's an existential question for the sector, and they need to figure that out. There's an anecdote I heard that for a long while, the primary objective of the R&D department for Tata Motors, which is one of India's finest companies, was how do you load 20 tons of goods on a 6-ton truck? Because at that time, that was the business requirement that was there. Capital was difficult. You had limited manufacturing capability, you had limited buying ability, but you needed to transport goods. Mercifully and inspiringly, things have moved on a lot more. And the Tata Steel is looking at how to use hydrogen better, how to improve fuel efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the kind of journey that needs to happen. The interesting point is we have seen catalyzing of these ecosystem before. For example, in most notably in fintech, in financial technologies, we've seen how that innovation and those market forces and the business potential can come in, and how government policies can support work. We need to see the same thing in climate tech. It's not the same. Obviously, the capital requirements are a lot higher. Hopefully, the returns are equally high.
Thank you. That's, again, very thoughtful answer. I appreciate it. And I'd like to point out for everybody, one thing that I pulled out of that is how to measure the economic conditions around climate tech, and bringing to the front the need to calculate the lifetime cost as well as the lifetime benefits of greener solutions. Thanks very much. Amit, over to you.
Great. Hisham, we have a question from Paulo, who has joined all the way from. So just like to read that out. Brazil has several conditions very similar to those in India. Green hydrogen is one of the most important trends in energy investments in Brazil as a way of storing solar and wind energy, which are very abundant. The prospect is that green hydrogen produced here will be at least 30% cheaper than that produced elsewhere. How the green hydrogen transportation logistic from production centers to the highest energy consuming countries would decrease the cost advantage. So his question is more pertaining from a strategic viewpoint. Over to you, Hisham.
Yeah, so let's talk about hydrogen, because Brazil is looking at it as 30%. I think India thinks that we can make it at 50% cheaper. So I'm sure there's lots of rivalry going on there. the potential of green hydrogen to transform the world energy mix is very real. But you know, from an Indian point of view, or indeed from a Brazilian point of view, green hydrogen is something which both countries can go big on, but also need to go right on. And here's a couple of things that I don't think policymakers in many countries, and this isn't limited to Brazil or India, aren't looking at. The basic science of it suggests that if you can electrify something, you're more likely to be better served just electrifying it rather than using renewable energy to produce green hydrogen and then electrifying it. You know, the amount of energy loss that you have in this thermodynamics just means that it doesn't make sense. So, for example, using green or indeed any other color hydrogen to power a hydrogen scooter when you can just as easily run it on electricity doesn't make sense. Using green hydrogen for where you need a high energy source, like a steel plant or, you know, chemicals process, that makes a lot of sense, and you should look at doing that. The second aspect of it is that hydrogen is a much smaller molecule, and so there is a much higher risk of hydrogen leakage. And the broad science is that if you end up leaking more than 10%, you lose all of the benefits that you think you might have gained in the production of that green hydrogen through leakage. Within these two constraints, if we are able to manage those two constraints, and the third constraint that's there is everyone wants additional renewables energy, right? That renewable energy requires capital. That renewable energy, if it's mostly solar, would require land, etc. Are you directing what could go to renewables energy generation to production of green hydrogen? Because then you might not quite be hitting the mark. I don't know the specifics in Brazil, but I can tell you that from an Indian government point of view, what they're looking at is 125 gigawatts of additional renewables capacity to fuel the green hydrogen ambitions of the country. And that's essential. You don't want hydrogen to take away from, you know, the renewables energies requirements that are out there. Within all of that, if we manage all of this, the production, the transportation costs are likely to be manageable. I don't think that you would have as much of an issue on the transporting of hydrogen. I think in many cases, certainly from an Indian point of view, India is looking at hydrogen and saying, for the first time in history, we might start becoming a net energy exporter to Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, countries where we don't have, you know, the level of renewables capacity. So I don't think the transport cost factor will be there, but I will say that in transport, you really need to be careful about the leakages question. And you know, within this is just a point of saying, as much as possible, interrogate the science on any climate solution. Don't believe what a climate change NGO suddenly comes and tells you. Do the science yourself as a country. Build that capacity and expertise to figure out the science. We've had many fads, far too many. For once upon a time, some members in the climate community were the ones who were selling diesel cars as the more fuel efficient option. So, if you look at Europe and the way subsidies have worked, you have much more solar in North Europe, and where there is less sun, and much more wind in the southern part of Europe, where there is less wind, because policymakers got enamored by the next cool thing that was out there.
Mm-hmm. Great, Hisham. And you've been iterating a very important point, that it is a collective effort. And there is a recent thing that the Prime Minister in India also said, and everybody in the policy circles talking about it, and that's called LIFE, that is lifestyle for environment. That seems to be more like a collective effort or an idea. How do you really look at it? I think that will be an important element in really solving the thing. Because, of course, the policymaker can do so much, industry can do so much. As an individual as well, I think there is a huge responsibility on us to make a few changes.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the production side of things, but the world needs a fundamentally different consumption model. And I'm not suggesting that we go back to the Stone Age or we all go back to some kind of rudimentary life, but there are so many frightening examples of excessive consumption that need to be addressed. You know, I read an article a few months ago when public swimming pools, open air swimming pools in Germany, as part of their way of showing solidarity with, you know, with the fight in Ukraine, were going to reduce the temperature by 1 degree. And I thought to myself, that's really, you know, like, seriously, is that where we're at, where instead of 27 degrees, we're going to have, you know, open air swimming pools in winter reduced by 1 degree? Immoral almost. So there is the need for a different consumption model. The fact that per capita emissions are as high as they are in many parts of the industrial world suggests that you need to make the energy more green, but you also need to spend as much time and effort on driving energy efficiency. And energy efficiency and circular economy are not you know, cute romantic ideas. They are business levers that can drive you know, superior business performance. If you had a more circular economy based supply chain, it reduces risk, it reduces costs, it gives you more predictability in your supply chains. So that I think that's where the country is going now. In India, we are lucky because from a cultural point of view, a lot of the aspects of frugality are more naturally you know, ingrained in Indian society. I know that in the US, circularity is regarded as a little bit of a you know, airy-fairy, slightly idealistic notion from European environmentalists, and you know, some of that bad press is not helpful. If the US were to look at aspects of circularity and better consumption models, and not regard them as like a personal challenge. Nobody's taking away your fridges or your microwaves or whatever it is that someone seems to be thinking they're taking away. But the world needs a different consumption model, that's for sure.
And Hisham, sorry, over to you, Richard.
Yeah, excuse me, let me jump in on this because I think your last point, I wanted to bring up the whole concept of climate justice. And I think that it's absolutely critical not to put this in terms of punishment for what people in the past used to do, but as an important recognition of responsibility in achieving a shared better outcome for all. And I'm really curious, in India, there must be concern about the kind of soft political power that would come along with a lot of money coming on the table from outside. Do you have insights about how to get around that problem?
So tell me, just to clarify, when you say the soft political power,
okay, so let's say that through some international organization, US and European and other advanced nations contributed in some sort of climate pool, right, of funds that would become accessible for better development pattern in places like India. You know, how do you make sure that that's not really a cover for helping American and European and other advanced nation companies do better in comparison to local industry?
Sure. I'm going to take it in 2 or 3 different directions because there's lots of aspects to it. The first is that one of the things that India and many other developing countries find jarring, and that's my politest term, is almost the hypocrisy of a lot of the international funding that's there, where the basic narrative is you should stop using coal, but we get to continue to use gas. That's not viable. So, a lot of these countries aren't using coal because they love coal. They're using coal because they don't have a choice. And when you're working on energy, you have two options. One is you can go down the route of you must shut down coal yesterday, or you go down the route of, hey, here are 5 things you can do to advance renewables. It's far more constructive to be able to use the latter argument. The second aspect is around climate financing per se. When you see some of the momentum that's happening in Europe and America around climate action, it's really positive and it's a good thing for the world. However, one other way of looking at, for example, the IRA bill is $300 billion of climate investment in the US, which is great, but it's make in America, build in America, design in America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's easy for folks outside of the US to look at this and say, hey, this isn't about climate, this is about protectionism. The reason why Macron landed up in DC a few months ago was to rail against what he felt was protectionism by America under the IRA bill. At the same time, when you look at the cross-border adjustment mechanism that the European Union is likely to put together, it's so easy to interpret that as the next frontier of trade wars. So it's not even soft power. It's almost like the Indian power minister yesterday or a couple of days ago was talking about the fact that all of these, you call them green subsidies for your domestic sector, but actually what it's doing is making international players uncompetitive. On the soft power, otherwise, I haven't yet come across examples where there is that sense. I think the broader risk matrix that's there is if you look at electric vehicles and more broadly battery technology. The Chinese, for example, many years ago took a call realizing that EVs were the future and started investing in electric vehicle technology. And so much of the innovation in electric vehicles has come from China. The Chinese, a few years earlier, realized that you're going to need some of these critical minerals and have made a lot of investments in trying to secure the natural sources for that. A lot of countries, India and the US included, have missed that path. I think where it would be useful for both countries and every other country in the world is to start investing in critical mineral alternative technologies. But you need to make really big investments on that. These are, moonshot kind of investment levels that one is needing to look at.
Mm-hmm. And
thank you,
Hisham. One question from my side. When we are having this conversation, we possibly are the converted who believe that climate change is real. We need to make those important, steps, or take those important steps. But there is also a part of the world who are the nation who says like nothing's happening. Climate change is absolutely the biggest bunkum the world has seen in the last 500 years or whatever. How do you make them understand that the challenge is real? How would you want to do that? Because if we don't have that population on our side or those set of people on our side, there is always a chance that we are going to be staring at failure.
I think we've all gone through that experience where you read someone who writes something on Twitter and you think, I'm going to convince and persuade this person through, logic and reason. And we've all failed. I don't think anybody's ever been converted. So there is one of the encouraging things about India is you don't have the level of climate denialism that you see in some other parts of the world, notably in the US, where you've got almost like ideological divides across it. In India, there's a broad consensus that there is understanding about it. There may be different levels of momentum and capability and understanding of how to actually do something, but you don't at least have the denial part of it. I think the way forward is to just talk less about climate change and emissions and talk more about the economic opportunity, the national security opportunity. For example, if India goes 50% renewables, it is not just about climate. It's as much as about economics. It's as much about national security. It's as much about being more independent in geopolitics. And those are arguments which it is difficult for a denier to, a climate denier to find fault, and it's trying to find that common ground, which is positive. And I think one thing that's also clear is the doomsday narrative has never worked. It doesn't work beyond a small pre-converted bubble in any case. So saying that the world is going to end tomorrow, it hasn't helped convert anybody. And so let's pause on that and ease up on that. Have the science to back you up, but talk about the opportunity going forward. That's the way you get kind of the middle ground. The people in the extreme, they stay where they are. They don't shift.
Sure. Hisham, this has been a very fascinating interaction. I think we could have gone on this interaction for many more hours, but we have to, we are up, what I call up with our time. Some amazing perspectives, a lot to learn. And I do take away one thing, that there is some need to really create an initiative wherein we are able to bring people together. Possibly, if we can be of any help, it would be a pleasure to really create that connection between the corporations, the new business ideas here within the US-ATMC and the India Dialog thing, and would love to get connected on that. But we should continue these conversations. I think there is and it is all about, at the end of the day, improving the quality of lives of people, improving our standard of living. And as I take it away, like one of the most important aspects that you said, that it is about aspirations, which is about quality of life, improving our state of being, not just about money. And that is what we need to really focus on. And the solutions are there for us to really manage, look at, and implement. So Hisham, thanks a lot. And for the audience, I would just like to next month, we will be back again, and we'll have Pranjal Sharma who would be joining, and we have many more speakers who are going to be joining us, including Arun Kumar, Rajiv Chandrasekhar, Sanjeev Sanyal, Sean Rondolph, over the next few months. So look forward to having you with us again. Thanks a lot, Hisham. Thank you, Richard, for joining in. It was absolutely a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.